What's up, Nut Gang? Welcome to another episode of American History in a Nutshell. This episode, we're going to go on the Shay's Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. So, I hope you remember your rights, because you better remain silent so you can listen to me prattle on about early American rebellions. Exciting stuff. So, yeah, grab some nuts, grab some whiskey, and let's get into it. When you think about American rebellions, what comes to mind? For most of y'all, I bet you think of the American Revolution, maybe even the Civil War. However, early America was marred by instability. There were several early struggles with our nation. It wasn't as stable as people think. Just because we won a revolution doesn't mean that, everything's all sunshine and rainbows now. Just like any other nation, we had growing pains. Now, we weren't to the point of like China or Germany where the country would just deunify and unify every 100 years. But we weren't the pinnacle of stability. There were plenty of petty squabbles early on, and even though I can't name them all, we're going to be focusing on two today. Shay's Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. These two rebellions are the two that I feel really encapsulate the progression of early America and how it became what we know today. Let's get into it.
Wait a minute!
However, before we jump into the rebellions, we have to discuss the Articles of Confederation. Now, this document deserves its own video, but I'm going to give a brief overview here. Now, before we adopted the Constitution in 1787, or pretty sure 1787, we adopted the Articles of Confederation in 1777. And without getting too much into the details, because this video is not about the Articles of Confederation, I'm going to focus on a couple of things that were the reason that these two rebellions sprang up, or I guess just Shay's Rebellion right now. The root of these struggles in early America was the lack of federal power. The federal government had almost no powers. The United States wasn't a formal union at this point, but a league of friendship. The reason why early America wasn't too keen on having this strong federal government was because they had just gotten out of a tyrannical, dictatorial government that bossed them around and imposed acts on them that violated their natural rights. A comparable entity to early America would probably be the European Union, though the Articles of Confederation granted even less power to the federal government. Each state wasn't subject to a larger federal government, at least to the extent the European nations are today, but each state was basically its own nation. A huge thing to consider in this era was there was not really a national American identity. You didn't identify yourself as American. You identified yourself as like a New Yorker, as a Georgian, as a Vermontian. You weren't American. The pre-constitutional government notably lacked the three-pillar government we see today. The judicial, the executive, and the legislative branch. There's only one Congress without the bicameral houses. The only governing body the federal government had was one Congress, no House, no Senate, just one Congress. And each state sent 2 to 6 delegates to Congress, which voted on things for the states. But these powers were also extremely limited. The founders didn't want a government that was so strong it could overrule the powers and rights of the states and people. The only powers the founders gave to the federal government at this point were the power to diplomatically deal with other nations, address territorial disputes, and deal with Native Americans. Not really that much power, huh? Yeah, sure, dealing with foreign nations and your own territories is important, but most of the work has to go to the states, which, if you remember, unlike European nations, were not strong at all. The American Revolution was a bloody one, which left lots of states destitute and needy. Speaking of money, the Articles of Confederation had no way to deal with money. Money, the root of all evil. But it's one of the main problems and topics that each governmental document and nation has to address. To put it in plain terms, America was broke, and they had no way to get out of its mountain of debt. They owed a lot of money to foreign nations like France, Spain, Russia, the Netherlands, and even some to Britain. By the way, never get into debt, folks. You'll probably regret that. Without a way to standardize money, the United States had no way of getting a start as a nation. It's also worth noting that many of the American revolutionaries were promised land and money, and the United States government had no way to really give all of the veterans that. The first attempt by pre-constitutional America to standardize currency was the Continental Dollar, or Continental Currency, or Continentals for short. Continentals were paper money that were first printed right before the Revolution in 1775. And they had weird denominations on them. Like, there was 1/6 of a dollar, and there was an $80 bill. Like, it was really weird. Not like our currency right now, which looks really nice with their, like, units of 5. Another weird thing that made Continentals horrible was the difference in exchange rates between states. For example, a Continental was 5 shillings in Georgia, it was 8 shillings in New York, and 32.5 in South Carolina. Side note, you ever find it crazy that we've just all accepted that paper with numbers on it is an acceptable form of money? Like, we just gave it value. It's pretty crazy. Anyways, due to the massive failure of the continental currency, early America had no way to pay off their debt. It had no way to make money because trading for money is useless if your money is worthless. Early America would have to resort to something drastic. The dreaded T word, taxes. Shay's Rebellion, this is where we start to get into it. So, the pre-constitutional government was useless in collecting taxes. They couldn't enforce taxes, multiple groups of people like the Quakers outright refused to pay taxes, and the states didn't care. Taxes were a huge part of why the revolution happened, so why should this new government tax them? Ultimately, the government's inability to collect taxes and in turn pay back the revolutionaries and its debts had quite a lot of the revolutionaries disgruntled. And so what do you get when a bunch of revolutionaries, still drunk off the victory of freedom, become more disgruntled? Well, more revolutions, of course. So this story starts in Massachusetts. Governor John Hancock, yes, the guy with a big signature on the Declaration of Independence, he resigned. He's still stating health issues. It's suspected he actually resigned because he could sniff out the trouble coming on the horizon, but that's unimportant for now. His replacement, a member of the merchant elite named James Bowdoin. Of course, since Bowdoin was one of the lenders and had the best interests of his fellow lenders in mind, he had a much more strict tax policy as opposed to Hancock. He would milk the taxes out of the veterans, and that was the last thing he did. As the veterans had not been paid by the federal government, they could not pay the taxes back, and as a result, some were in prison and others had their belongings taken away. Now, one of these unfortunate veterans was a guy named Daniel Shay. He and a lot of other veterans who felt disenfranchised organized a march in Northampton, Massachusetts on August 29th, 1786, and shut down the court there, meaning they couldn't hold any trials or deaths for that day. They called themselves the Regulators, a reference to the 1760s regulator movement in North Carolina, which reformed corrupt practices in the state. A couple days later, on September 5th, a court in Worcester, Massachusetts, was also shut down by a march. Down in Rhode Island, some protesters were dealt with without violence by forcing merchants to trade debt for undervalued money, which Bowdoin and his troop of merchants weren't too happy with. On September 26th, Daniel Shays and the Regulators organized another protest in Northampton. Shutting down that court the same day, Shay's colleague Luke Day organized a protest in Springfield, where the Massachusetts Supreme Court was going to meet to judge 11 leaders of the rebellion, while the local militia commander William Shepard intercepted them outside the courthouse, and the protesters just peacefully protested outside there, not storming into the courthouse to take it over. The court was adjourned without hearing any cases. Throughout September and October, multiple courthouses in Great Barrington, Concord, and Taunton were shut down as well. The government started to get more involved as they arrested more members of the Regulators. James Bowdoin eventually made a private militia and put General Benjamin Lincoln in charge. While the government forces assembled, Shays, Day, and the rebels were planning an attack on the Federal Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. The initial day of the attack was supposed to be January 25th, but Day would not be ready until the 26th, and so he sent a courier to tell Shays that. However, the courier got intercepted, and basically they got caught. When they went to battle on the 25th, not knowing that Day wasn't ready, they got knocked back, and Shepard defeated them. Now, the rebels were grouped at Amherst and set up camp in Petersham, Massachusetts, but it was too late at this point. General Lincoln was on his way to capture them, and he ended up capturing and arresting many rebel soldiers, putting an end to the rebellion. Lessons learned. This rebellion made it clear that the federal government under the Articles of Confederation wasn't the way forward. If the federal government was powerless to stop these rebellions, it wouldn't last. This rebellion led to the creation of the Constitution, which alleviated the three main problems that led to this rebellion: the ability to regulate currency, or lack of it, the lack of ability to tax, and the lack of ability of the government to have an army. Luckily for us, the Constitution covers all of these in Article 1, Section 8. The first clause of this section states that the government has power to lay and collect taxes, duties, impositions, and excises to pay off debts. It made it possible for the government to gather the money to pay back its debts to the foreign nations and the veterans. Clause 5 gives exclusive power to the federal government to coin money, regulate its value, and fix the standards and weighted measures, making it so that all the nonsense and confusion of the continental currency and state currency was fixed, making the dollar the only valid form of currency in the United States. Clauses 12, 14, and 16 and Section 2 give the power to the federal government to make an army and a navy, and later Air Force, Coast Guard, Space Force, all those things, to protect the land. It also made the president commander-in-chief. Alright, so now that people had to pay taxes, there was sure to be some unrest in America now. In 1791, President George Washington signed into law the whiskey tax. Uncle Sam now could mandate people pay excise on whiskey, America's drink. America and alcohol goes together just like peanut butter and jelly, and Mexicans and tequila. People who got especially mad at this new whiskey tax were farmers in western Pennsylvania, who viewed it as unfairly targeting Westerners, who often supplemented their income with small whiskey stills. On top of that, all stills now had to be registered to the federal government, and those who failed had to go on the long journey to Philadelphia, the nearest federal court in Pennsylvania. As a result, many refused to pay, and they advocated for a change in the acts, which the government did by reducing the tax by 1 cent. Which, by the way, it was actually a pretty good amount back in that time when the dollar was worth a lot more than it is now. However, these attempts to appease the Westerners were largely unsatisfactory, and violence would soon break out. Robert Johnson, a tax collector sent to collect whiskey tax, was tarred and feathered by a disguised gang in Warrenton County. By the way, if you don't know what tarring and feathering is, can editor put a picture right here? Yeah. Likewise, a man sent to serve court warrants to that gang who did the tarring and feathering was whipped, tarred, and feathered as well. A convention in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the place where all great things happen, of course, was established to discuss against the whiskey tax, and a violent group called the Mingo Creek Association dominated the speakings, and the whiskey tax would soon turn violent. A federal tax inspector for Western Pennsylvania and a general named John Neville was at first an opponent of the whiskey tax, but he changed his mind, which angered many Western Pennsylvanians. As a result, while he was renting a place out in Pittsburgh, the Mingo Creek Association forced the landlord to kick him out, threatening violence. And then other tax collectors and officials would soon follow. In June, people burned an effigy of Neville. On September 22nd, 1793, tax collector Benjamin Wells was held at gunpoint in his home to surrender his commission. And on August 9th, 1794, 30 men surrounded the house of tax collector William McCleary in Morgantown, Virginia, sieging the city for 3 days. At this point, it was clear something had to be done, and this would be the first step of the Constitution to see if the newly made army could hold up. Of course, they were aided by different state militias, but it was the first undertaking by George Washington and his crew to actually fight a domestic threat. U.S. Marshal David Lennox and General Neville went to Western Pennsylvania to serve writs to people for the whiskey tax. Most of them didn't really bring any opposition, but the house of a man named Oliver Miller, 10 miles south of Pittsburgh, on July 15th, they had some resistance and got into a little firefight which left no one injured. Now, the next day, at least 30 Mingo Creek militiamen surrounded Neville's house at Belwer Hill, demanding his surrender. Neville responded by having his slaves help defend him and fired a shot, killing Oliver Miller, and the rebels retreated to nearby Calder's Fort. The day after that, the rebels, now 600 strong, returned to Belwer Hill, now commanded by Major James McFarland. Neville now had 10 U.S. Army soldiers, under the command of Major Abraham Kirkpatrick, Neville's brother-in-law. And after a couple hours of firefight, McFarland called for a ceasefire. When McFarland walked into the house, he was shot dead, and then enraged rebels set fire to the house. With McFarland's death, the rebels became more radical. Some wanted to loot and burn Pittsburgh, and others wanted to attack Fort Fayette. The rebels' attack on Pittsburgh was stopped by the banishing of 3 men critical of the rebellion, caused them to keep a defiant march. The only torched building was Major Kirkpatrick's farm. On August 14th, 226 whiskey rebels met up at Parkinson's Ferry, which is now called Whiskey Point, in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. There, they resolved to have a peace talk with George Washington, who was sending peace delegates. In early August 1794, Washington dispatched 3 commissioners to the west, all Pennsylvanian: Attorney General William Bradford, Justice Jasper Yates of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and Senator James Ross. He also commanded insurgents to cease operations by September 1st. A committee of Westerners held a vote on whether to submit to the government's demands, and they narrowly agreed to submit. A popular referendum on September 11th also had mixed results. Some townships happily submitted to U.S. law, but some, especially the poorer townships, still resisted. On September 24th, 1794, Washington was recommended to send military force to aid civil authorities. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia militias were all sent to help the next day. The federal militia grew to 12,950 men, which was huge for the time. However, not many volunteered, so a draft was implemented. As expected, a lot of people resisted, and there ended up being riots and protests about the draft, resulting in over 100 arrests and at least 2 people killed. On September 30th, after the militia was gathered, Washington himself headed up to Pennsylvania to command and oversee the operation. He met up with his men at Reading, Pennsylvania, and headed west. After one show of force in western Pennsylvania, the protests mostly ended. It collapsed in October as the army marched further west. Many arrests were made and many rebels fled into the Appalachians, resulting in the end of the Whiskey Rebellion. In conclusion, we can see how rebellions changed the way the government was formed. From the Articles of Confederation leading to a weak federal government that was pretty much powerless to stop Shay's rebellion, to the government starting to be able to crack down on civil unrest with the Whiskey Rebellion, the Constitution was a game changer for federal power. Without it, America would not exist today. We would have inevitably collapsed under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution has proven to be effective in handling insurgencies, as we can see from both the Whiskey Rebellion and later on the Civil War. Further on, we can see how before the Constitution, the government had absolutely no power to actually carry out federal law. And under the Constitution, as we can see, it could actually impose, taxes, it could regulate its money, and it could take down these rebellions that threaten the nation. And that's basically it. Thank you for watching, and remember to like, subscribe, and share with everyone you know, like your mom, your dad, your sister, your dog, your best friend, the homeless guy at the 7-Eleven. I implore you, please share this. So, this has been American history in a nutshell. Thank you for watching.